Thanks, Shani. I'm just going to pick a few points on the whole idea of how Pakistani and Indian nationalism has been constructed after independence in 1947 around the issue of Kashmir, who owns Kashmir, who has a right to Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, the whole state. And sadly, that whole evolution of a debate and construction of identities of both the nations has meant that there has been a marginalization, bordering on almost exclusion of what the Kashmiris have always wanted, or what always their identity, or the term Kashmir that you referred to earlier. And I think, from the Pakistani perspective, Pakistan has obviously used the Kashmir issue and the whole imagination of occupied Kashmir as the central plank of its nationhood. So the construction of Pakistani identity and the way Pakistan ought to be and the policy choices it makes have centered on the idea of regaining Kashmir either through military force or through other means. And that has extracted a heavy price from Pakistan, not just in terms of the military spending, but all the 4 wars, minor and major, waged with India, and the way they have led to various upheavals within Pakistan, including the breakup of the country in 1971, and later on the most recent conflict of Kargil in 1999, which unfortunately came to harm the Kashmir quote-unquote cause, as we say in Pakistan, more than support it or enhance it. At the same time, the Indian nationalism and the Indian nationhood has also treated Kashmir as a jewel in the crown, and how important it is and how central it is to both the geographical as well as the nationalistic identity of India. And that has also led to the kind of permanent hostility between the two countries. And as we speak, I mean, while it is true that in India a lot of people and a lot of analysts and thinkers say that Pakistan is no longer the threat to India and it's China or whatever, but the reality is that nearly 60 to 70% of Indian armed forces are deployed along the Pakistani borders, and that does create a whole dynamic and momentum of its own. So regardless of what the official strategic forecasting would be, but the reality is that Pakistan is also considered to be that particular, the enemy, the way Pakistan considers India to be like that. But Pakistan's issue is far deeper, because the way Pakistani or Pakistaniyat is defined is anything and everything but Indian. So that makes it even more problematic, because then you have to kind of delink Pakistan from its thousands of years of history in the region, from its geographical and cultural heritage with India and other parts of South Asia. And this dynamic has played out both in terms of the arms build-up, in terms of the public narratives, the discourses that are popular in media, etc. So, for example, if you see Bollywood movies until the recent Heather film came out, all earlier Bollywood films somehow projected that Indian identity and Kashmir being central to that, and there was always this lurking foreign Parosi neighboring enemy out to come and destroy that identity. And if you look at Pakistani popular narratives, the film, the textbooks, you also see the same idea of this larger neighbor occupying the Kashmiri population and the Kashmiri territory, and somehow that has to be liberated as an article of faith in Pakistani nationhood. So regardless of saying whether they're right or wrong, I mean, I'm just presenting them to you while building the argument that both these narratives and both these ideas of Kashmir are excluded what the Kashmiris have wanted, or what the people there kind of aspired for, whether it is self-determination. I mean, in the earlier panel, we showed various 5 or 6 ideas that have captured the political discourse and also the negotiations from full independence to autonomy to elections to self-governance to other various means. But the problem has been that only in recent years has this particular factor been acknowledged, that the Kashmiris are central to whatever happens to the future of Jammu and Kashmir, whether it is a part of India and it is going to be governed under the Indian constitutional framework, or whether it is going to have a different autonomous status. The Kashmiris ought to be central to that conversation and dialogue. And I think more and more that is coming out in the new sort of forms of communication that we see, particularly in the new media, for example, where you see a lot of young Kashmiris articulating their political views, and despite the fact that there has been earlier, I mean censorship also exists on both sides, sadly, but new media has sort of challenged that and kind of undone some of those barriers. And you do see a lot of clamoring for either an autonomous solution or some of the hardliners even argue for independence. And the polls also show that kind of split. All the opinion polls that have been taken in both Pakistani side and the Indian side, nearly 40 to 50% of those interviewed have asked for an independent solution to Kashmir. Now, which way that goes, I think that has to do with a lot of, as was mentioned in the earlier panel, between how Indian and Pakistani states act to move forward and find a way whereby this long-standing dispute is either addressed or settled in some way. I think the most encouraging moment was under General Musharraf and Manmohan Singh, when India and Pakistan moved towards a 4-point formula, and both sides have now, I mean, there's enough evidence to say that it was not just a kind of floating proposal, but there was a lot of paperwork done on it. And Mr. Manmohan Singh's aide wrote a book recently in which he corroborates that the former Indian Prime Minister had himself looked at those papers and made some changes with his pen. And Musharraf's Foreign Minister, Khurshid Kasuri, has also confirmed that there was a back-channel diplomatic effort going on, and both the sides were close to that particular deal. How does it pan out? I think the most adverse influence it has had, the India-Pakistan tension and the competing nation-state imagination has had on the concept of Kashmir itself. Because on the one hand, you have thousands of Kashmiri Pandits who have been dislocated, made homeless within their, and many fear going back to the place. I mean, there has been some recent movement of restarting that process, but the idea is that they have been marginalized and excluded, and then you have a lot of Kashmiris who have also been are being radicalized, and much like the South Asian Islam, the Kashmiri Muslim identity was also a very hybrid and plural identity. The existence of large shrine networks and the Sufi saints and other dargahs was a very inclusive and a pluralistic, a secular vision of Muslim identity. That's hardly since late 1980s, both after the Kashmiri uprising and the Pakistan-based militant groups entering into the fray for nearly a decade, have shifted that whole identity, and there is more and more radicalization that we see among the Kashmiri voices. I mean, there are Kashmiri politicians wearing a whole, a burqa with not just a burqa, but with these black gloves, which are not even worn in Saudi Arabia. And I saw this lady politician on TV, and I was wondering where it came from. I think it was a decade ago. And then all the networks that have been penetrating in the Kashmiri society, and these are the networks that argue and promote the Salafi Wahhabi version of Islamic identity is then linked to both what is happening in Pakistan and to some degree within the Indian Muslims as well. And I think that has been a real tragic outcome of this long-standing dispute, and particularly after the 1989 onwards, where this Kashmiri idea has been now, being sort of pulled in two different directions of extreme views of the Hindu and Muslim religion. And finally, I would also like to make a point that I think in general, violent extremism and exclusion have been studied in various contexts. And other than the fact that, as Lisa Curtis in the earlier panel mentioned about the terrorist networks that operate, from Pakistan and some alleged within Kashmir as well. The idea that there's a draconian Army Special Forces Act, which was also referred to by Sasha as a contesting point, and that may lead to some political upheavals. And the idea that increasingly it is a securitized state with a large number of security personnel do not really encourage a kind of an organic or a democratic pluralistic solution. So the numbers vary, from 300,000 to 700,000, depending which way you look at. But there's a consensus that nearly 500,000 police, paramilitary, armed forces troops are stationed in Jammu and Kashmir. And the Indian government does not really disclose the exact number, but the presence of this and the reaction of that must also be taken into account while looking at how the local population operates in this sort of arena where hardline terrorist or Islamic militant groups operate from the Pakistani side and get some local support, but also the kind of exclusion that the young Kashmiris face and the kind of police barricades. And there are many stories and books now being authored about that. So I think it kind of complicates the whole scenario, because then it definitely shifts the solution or the move towards a more reasoned and a more kind of a democratic outcome of the conflict and the contested identities in the region. I'll stop.